At my granddaughter's wedding, my own son tried to give away my home like I was already gone. I remember the exact moment because the room didn't go silent right away. It stayed warm, filled with soft laughter and the clinking of glasses, as if what he had just said was charming, even generous. And for a brief second I wondered if I had misheard him, if perhaps grief or age had finally started to blur the edges of my understanding. But then I saw the way Sophia smiled beside him, that careful, polished smile that never quite reached her eyes, and I knew I had heard perfectly. Daniel stood tall at the center of the reception floor, his hand wrapped around a crystal champagne flute, the light catching the gold band on his finger, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily across the room. Confident, practiced, the voice he used in boardrooms and negotiations. "Family always takes care of each other," he said, and there were nods, soft murmurs of agreement. The kind people give when they think they are witnessing something heartfelt, something noble. And then he turned. Slightly, just enough for every guest to follow his gaze until it landed on me, seated quietly at my table near the edge of the room. "And my mother," he continued, "has always believed that." There was a pause then, deliberate, calculated, and I could feel the attention shift fully onto me, like a spotlight warming my skin. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply held my glass a little tighter, feeling the thin stem press into my fingers. "Which is why," he added, smiling wider now, "she's agreed to let us start our family in her penthouse." There it was, laid out cleanly, elegantly, as if it had already been decided, as if I had already given my consent, and the room responded exactly as he expected. A ripple of impressed whispers, a few scattered claps. Someone even said, "That's beautiful." And I watched it all unfold without interrupting, because I had learned a long time ago that people reveal far more when you let them believe they are in control. I lifted my glass slowly, bringing it to my lips, not to drink, but to give myself a moment to study their faces. Daniel looked relieved, almost proud, as though he had just secured something important. Sophia's hand rested lightly on his arm, her posture perfect, her expression soft, but there was something underneath it, something sharp and expectant, like she was waiting for the final piece to fall into place. And then there was Lily, my granddaughter, radiant in her white dress, standing just a few feet away, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered, because even she could feel it, the shift, the subtle wrongness beneath the polished surface. I set my glass down carefully, the base touching the table with a soft, controlled sound, and I let my gaze drift across the room, past the floral arrangements, past the glittering chandeliers, past the guests who were now watching me with polite curiosity, waiting for me to confirm the story that had just been written for me. And I did smile, just as they expected, just as they had likely predicted I would, because that was who I had always been to them, the one who made things easy, the one who smoothed over discomfort, the one who said yes when it mattered. But inside, something had already shifted long before this moment. It had begun the night before, with a phone call that came too late to be casual and too careful to be innocent, a voice on the other end asking questions about property records, about ownership, about things no one should have been discussing without me. And I had listened, quietly, asking very little, learning just enough, and after that call, I had sat in my living room, in that very penthouse they were now so eager to claim, and I had looked around at the space I had built, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, the furniture chosen piece by piece over the years, the photographs lining the shelves, each one a fragment of a life I had given to my family, and for the first time, I had allowed myself to see it not as something shared, but as something protected, something that had been quietly placed out of reach without their knowledge. So when Daniel stood there now, offering it away as if it were his to promise, I did not feel anger, not the kind that rises quickly and demands to be heard. I felt something colder, something steadier, a clarity that settled into place like a final decision. I folded my hands lightly in my lap, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than comfortable. And in that small gap, I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the brief tightening of Sophia's smile, because even they could sense it, the fact that I had not spoken, had not immediately agreed, had not played my part. And that was when I heard the faint sound of a chair moving behind me, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway, and I knew, without turning, exactly who it was, because there was only one person in that room who understood silence the way I did. Only one person who had taught me that sometimes the strongest response is the one you don't rush to give. And as the room began to quiet, as conversations softened and heads turned, I felt a calm settle over me, deeper than anything I had felt all evening, because whatever came next was no longer theirs to control. The sound of that chair moving was quiet, almost polite, but it carried further than any speech Daniel had just given, and one by one, the conversations around the room began to fade, not all at once, but in small, uneven drops, like people suddenly remembering they were supposed to be paying attention to something else. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my posture unchanged, but my awareness sharpened, because I knew what was coming before anyone else in that room did. Margaret Whitmore did not rush. She never had. She rose to her full height with a kind of calm that did not need permission, her silver hair perfectly set, her posture straight in a way that made people instinctively step aside, without understanding why. And as she took a single step forward, the faintest creak of the wooden floor beneath her heels seemed louder than the music still playing softly in the background. Daniel turned first, his smile still in place, but already tightening at the edges, as if he could not quite decide whether this interruption was part of his moment or something entirely different. Sophia followed, her eyes narrowing just slightly, the way they always did when something slipped beyond her control, and then the rest of the guests began to notice, their attention shifting not to the center of the room anymore, but to the quiet figure moving through the edge of it. Margaret did not look at Daniel at first. She looked at me, just for a brief second, and there was no question in that look, no hesitation, only a calm acknowledgement, as if we had already agreed on something without ever needing to say it out loud. I gave the smallest nod, barely more than a breath, and that was enough. She turned then, her gaze settling on Daniel with a steadiness that made his shoulders pull back instinctively. "That is a very generous statement," she said, her voice even, clear, not raised, but it carried across the room in a way that demanded silence. The kind of silence that is not forced but chosen. The kind that falls into place because people feel it is about to matter. Daniel let out a small laugh. The kind people use when they're trying to keep control of a situation that is beginning to shift. "Grandma, we were just sharing good news," he said, his tone light, practiced. "Mom has always wanted us to have more space, especially now." He gestured slightly toward Sophia, toward the future they were so eager to present, and for a moment, if someone had walked in at that exact second, they might have believed him. They might have thought this was a simple, loving exchange, but Margaret did not respond. Immediately, she let his words sit in the air, just long enough for their edges to show, and then she tilted her head slightly, as if considering something simple, something obvious. "I see," she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, no anger, which made it all the more unsettling, because it left no room for him to defend himself against anything clear. Sophia stepped forward then, just a fraction, her hand tightening around her glass. "We did not mean to surprise anyone," she added, smoothly. "We just thought it would be a beautiful way to start our next chapter, together." Her smile returned, controlled, warm in appearance, and she glanced toward me briefly, as if expecting me to support the narrative, to step in and confirm what had already been implied. But I did not move, I did not speak, I simply watched, and in that stillness, something else began to emerge, something they had not accounted for. Margaret took another step forward, closer now to the center of the room, and this time, she did not look at Daniel or Sophia. She looked at the guests, at the people who had been invited to witness a celebration, not a negotiation. "It is always interesting," she said slowly, to hear decisions announced before they have actually been made. There was a slight shift then, a ripple of unease moving through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel's smile faltered, just for a second. "I am not sure I understand," he replied, but his voice had lost a fraction of its confidence, the smoothness replaced by something tighter, more careful. Margaret's gaze returned to him, steady, patient. "Of course you do," she said, and there was no harshness in her words, only certainty, the kind that does not need to be explained. And for the first time, I saw it clearly, the realization beginning to form behind his eyes, not fully, not yet, but enough to make him shift his weight slightly. enough to make Sophia's fingers curl a little tighter around the stem of her glass, because something had changed, something they could not quite define, and in that moment, the room felt different, the music softer, the lights sharper, every detail suddenly more precise, as if the entire space had narrowed its focus to this one exchange. I remained seated, my expression calm, my breathing steady, because I had already lived through the part where this would have hurt. I had already sat alone the night before and let the truth settle into place, and what remained now was not pain, but clarity. Margaret drew a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but as if marking the moment, and then she spoke again, her voice just as even, just as controlled, but carrying something new now. Something that made Daniel's shoulders stiffen and Sophia's smile finally begin to fade. "You see," she said, "there is only one small detail missing from your announcement." She paused, not for effect, but because the silence itself had become part of the message, and in that silence, I could feel every eye in the room shifting again, not toward Daniel, not toward Sophia, but toward her, waiting, because whatever she was about to say was going to change everything. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out right away, and that alone was enough to shift the balance in the room, because he was not a man who hesitated, not in front of an audience, not when he believed he was in control. Sophia stepped in slightly, her voice smooth but just a touch too quick. "I am sure there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward me again, searching for support that was no longer there. But Margaret did not look at her. She did not acknowledge the attempt to redirect. Instead, she continued as if the interruption had never happened. "The detail," she said calmly, "is ownership." The word landed quietly, but it carried weight, the kind that settles in slowly before anyone fully understands why it matters. Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh, trying to recover the tone he had before. "Grandma, I think we all know who the penthouse belongs to," he said, gesturing lightly in my direction, as if that alone should resolve everything, as if the assumption was enough to make it true. And for a brief second, some of the tension eased. A few guests nodded, relieved to have something familiar to hold on to again, but Margaret's expression did not change, not even slightly. "Do we?" she asked, and there was no challenge in her voice, only a quiet certainty that made the question feel heavier than it sounded. Sophia's fingers tightened around her glass, the movement small, but noticeable now that everyone was watching more closely. "Evelyn has always managed her own affairs," she said carefully, choosing each word with precision, "and we have always respected that." It was a well-constructed sentence, polite, reasonable, the kind that should have smoothed things over, but it arrived too late, and it did not match the moment that had already been created. I remained still, my hands resting lightly together, my gaze steady, because I had nothing to add, nothing to correct. The truth was already moving forward without me. Margaret took one more step, just enough to stand fully in the open space at the center of the room, and now there was no doubt that every eye was on her. "Respect," she repeated softly, as if testing the word, and then she gave the smallest nod, as though acknowledging something only she could see. "That is a very important thing," she continued, "especially when it comes to matters that were never yours to begin with." The sentence was simple, almost gentle, but it cut through the air with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Daniel's smile disappeared completely now, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a slow, controlled way, as if he was trying to hold on to it and failing. "I am not sure what you mean," he said, and this time, the confidence was thinner, stretched. Sophia did not speak, but her posture shifted, her shoulders drawing in slightly, her attention no longer on the room but fixed entirely on Margaret, waiting, calculating, searching for the angle she could still use. But Margaret did not give her one. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply continued. "The penthouse," she said, "was placed into a trust 3 years ago." There was a pause, not because she needed one, but because the words themselves required space to settle, and in that space, the reaction began. Quiet at first, a few exchanged glances, a subtle straightening of posture. The kind of movement people make when they realize they may have been watching the wrong story unfold. Daniel blinked, once, slowly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "That cannot be right," he said, But even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice now, the absence of the certainty he had relied on only moments ago. Margaret's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "It is entirely correct," she replied, and there was no need for emphasis, no need for explanation, because the truth does not require decoration. Sophia's lips parted slightly, but she did not speak. Not yet, because this was not something she could redirect with a careful phrase or a polite smile. This was something solid, something structured, something that did not bend to presentation. I watched them both, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet recognition, because this was the moment they had not prepared for, the moment where the story they had constructed no longer held. Margaret folded her hands lightly in front of her, mirroring my own posture without even looking. "The terms of that trust," she continued, "are very specific." And now there was a shift, not just in the room, but in the energy itself, a tightening, a focus, as if every person present understood, without being told, that what came next would define everything that followed. Daniel took a small step forward, almost instinctively, as if proximity might give him back some control. "Grandma, I think we should discuss this privately," he said, his tone lower now, more controlled, more urgent, but Margaret did not move. She did not lower her voice. She did not allow the conversation to shrink. "There is no need," she said simply, "because this was never a private matter." And that was when it became clear, not just to me, not just to them, but to everyone in that room, that whatever had been planned for this evening was no longer theirs to decide. The silence did not break after Margaret spoke. It deepened, as if the entire room had shifted into a space where every word mattered more than before. Daniel stood still for a moment, his hand still holding the glass he had raised just minutes earlier. But now it seemed heavier, less certain, as if even he was unsure what to do with it. "A trust," he repeated, the words sounding unfamiliar in his own voice, not because he did not understand it, but because he had not expected it, and that difference was everything. Sophia stepped closer to him, just slightly, her shoulder aligning with his, a quiet gesture of unity. But there was tension in the way she held herself now, a stiffness that had not been there before. "Evelyn," she said, turning to me with a smile that tried to remain warm but no longer felt effortless. "I think we might have misunderstood how everything was arranged, but of course we can work through that together." Her tone was careful, measured, the kind people use when they are trying to regain control without appearing to do so. I met her gaze without changing my expression, without offering agreement or resistance, because there was nothing left for me to negotiate. That part had already been removed from the equation. Margaret did not look at me this time. She kept her focus on them, her presence steady, unshaken. "There is nothing to work through," she said calmly, and the simplicity of that statement seemed to carry more weight than any explanation could have. Daniel shifted his stance, his shoulders squaring as if he was preparing to push back, to re-establish his position. "With all due respect," he began, his voice firmer now, reaching for the authority he was used to having. "I think this is something that concerns our immediate family, and I would prefer to discuss it directly with my mother." The words were polite, structured, but there was an edge underneath them now, a clear attempt to draw a boundary, to move the conversation away from the room and back into a space he could manage. But Margaret did not step back. She did not lower her voice. She did not allow the conversation to shrink. "You are discussing it directly with her," she replied, her tone unchanged, and for a moment, the meaning did not fully land, not until Daniel followed her gaze and realized that I had not moved, had not intervened, had not corrected her, and that absence of reaction spoke louder than anything I could have said. Sophia's eyes flickered again, faster this time, between Margaret and me, as if she was recalculating, searching for a version of the situation that still worked in her favor, but the pieces were no longer aligning. Margaret folded her hands together, her posture composed, almost formal. "The trust was established with very clear terms," she continued, "and those terms were put in place precisely to prevent situations like this." The words were not accusatory, but they carried a quiet finality, a sense that this had been anticipated long before tonight. Daniel let out a short breath, a sound that might have been frustration or disbelief. "Prevent what?" he asked, and now there was no attempt to soften it. The question came out sharper, more direct. Prevent family from supporting each other, he added, and there was a faint murmur in the room again. The kind that comes when people recognize a familiar argument, something that sounds reasonable on the surface. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the question without conceding anything. Support is given, she said, not taken, and the distinction settled into the space between them, quiet but unmistakable. Sophia's hand lowered slightly, her grip on the glass loosening just enough to reveal the strain she had been holding back. No one is taking anything, she said, her voice still controlled. But there was a tightness now, a precision that felt less natural. We were simply discussing possibilities for the future. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something sharper, more focused. A future built on assumptions is rarely stable, she replied, and this time, the words landed more directly, because there was no room left to pretend this was a misunderstanding. Daniel's jaw tightened, the muscle moving slightly as he held his expression in place, and for the first time, I saw something I had not seen in him in years, uncertainty, not the kind that comes from lack of knowledge, but the kind that comes from realizing the foundation you were standing on is not as solid as you believed. He glanced at me then, really looked at me, not as the person he expected to agree, but as someone he needed an answer from. And in that moment, I could see the question forming behind his eyes, not spoken yet, but present, and I did not rush to fill that silence. I let it remain, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of revealing more than words ever could. Margaret took a small breath, steady, measured, and then she continued, her voice just as calm, just as even, but now carrying something more, something that made Sophia's posture shift again, made Daniel's attention sharpen. The trust does not allow for the transfer of residence, she said, nor does it permit occupancy by anyone other than its designated beneficiary. There was another pause, not for effect, but because the words themselves required time to be understood, and in that pause, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the meaning to fully settle. Daniel's fingers tightened around his glass, the movement small, but visible now. And who exactly is that beneficiary? He asked, and this time, there was no attempt to soften the question, no attempt to frame it as anything other than what it was, a direct challenge. Margaret met his gaze, without hesitation, without any shift in her composure, and for the first time since she had stood, there was the faintest hint of something else in her expression, not anger, not satisfaction, but something closer to certainty reaching its conclusion. That, she said, is the part you should have asked about before making your announcement. And with that, the balance in the room shifted again, more definitively this time, because now everyone understood that the answer to that question was going to change everything that came next. The question did not echo. It settled, heavy and deliberate, as if the entire room understood that whatever answer came next would not simply clarify things, it would redraw them completely. Daniel stood still, his eyes fixed on Margaret now, no longer glancing at the guests, no longer performing, because there was nothing left to perform. Sophia did not move either, but the stillness around her had changed. It was no longer controlled. It was calculated, as if she was holding herself in place while her mind worked rapidly beneath the surface, searching for an opening that might no longer exist. I remained seated, my posture unchanged, my hands resting lightly together, because I had already walked through this moment in my mind the night before, and I knew that the answer, when it came, would not need my voice to carry it. Margaret let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the question to settle fully, and then she spoke, her tone as calm as it had been from the beginning. The beneficiary, she said, is not Daniel, and it is not Sophia. The words were simple, direct, and for a brief second, the room seemed to pause entirely, as if everyone present needed a moment to adjust to the shift in expectation. Daniel blinked once, slowly, as though the statement had not aligned with the version of reality he had been operating under. Then who is it? He asked, and this time, there was no softness left in his voice, no attempt to frame it politely. It was a question that demanded clarity. Sophia's fingers tightened again around her glass, the faint sound of crystal against her ring just barely audible in the quiet. Margaret's gaze did not waver. She did not rush. She did not build suspense for the sake of it. She simply allowed the truth to arrive at its own pace. The trust was structured to ensure that the residence remains under the control of someone who understands its value, she said. And while the sentence did not immediately answer the question, it shifted the focus in a way that made the next part unavoidable. Daniel's expression tightened further, the lines at the corners of his mouth becoming more pronounced. "That does not answer my question," he said, and now there was an edge to his tone that he could no longer conceal. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. "It does," she replied. "You simply do not recognize the answer yet." There was a murmur then, quiet but present, as the guests began to absorb what was unfolding, not as a misunderstanding, but as something more structured, more deliberate, something that had been decided long before. Tonight, Sophia took a small step forward, just enough to place herself more directly in the center of the conversation. "With all due respect," she said, her voice steady but tighter now, "we have been discussing plans for months, and Evelyn has never indicated that there were any restrictions like this." Her words were carefully chosen, each one placed to suggest reason, fairness, expectation, but beneath them, there was something else now, something sharper, something that revealed how much this moment mattered to her. I met her gaze briefly, not to challenge, not to respond, but simply to acknowledge that I had heard her, and then I let my eyes move past her, back to Margaret, because the answer did not belong to me anymore. Margaret's expression remained composed, unchanged by the shift in tone. "There were no restrictions placed on your discussions," she said, "only on your assumptions." And that distinction landed with a clarity that made the air feel heavier. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did little to hide the tension building beneath it. "So you are saying," he began, his voice measured, deliberate, "that my mother cannot choose to let us live there?" It was framed as a question, but it carried the weight of a challenge. Margaret did not hesitate. "I am saying that the decision is not hers to make," she replied, and for the first time, there was a visible shift in Daniel's posture, a slight movement backward, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that the ground beneath him had changed. Sophia's eyes widened just slightly, the control she had maintained beginning to slip at the edges. "That makes no sense," she said, and now the smoothness was gone, replaced by something more immediate, more reactive. "If it is her residence, then of course it is her decision." Margaret's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "It was her residence," she said, and the correction, small as it was, carried a finality that could not be ignored. The room fell quieter still, if that was even possible, the kind of silence that does not just listen, but absorbs. Daniel's hand lowered slightly, the glass still in his grasp, but no longer raised, no longer part of any performance. "What does that mean?" he asked, and this time, there was something different in his voice, not just tension, but something closer to realization beginning to take shape. Margaret folded her hands lightly in front of her, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "It means," she said, "that the ownership was transferred, legally and permanently, under the terms of the trust." She paused, not for effect, but because the truth itself required space, and in that space, I could feel the moment fully settle, not as a surprise to me, but as a revelation to everyone else in that room. Sophia shook her head slightly, the movement small but firm. "Transferred to who?" she asked. And now there was no attempt to soften the question, no attempt to frame it politely. It was direct, urgent, necessary. Margaret met her gaze without hesitation, and for the first time since she had begun speaking, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not emotion, not reaction, but the quiet certainty of something reaching its conclusion. "To me," she said, and the words did not echo, they did not need to, because they settled into the room with a clarity that left no room for anything else. Daniel stood completely still, his expression fixed, as if his mind had not yet caught up to what he had just heard. Sophia's grip on her glass loosened just slightly, her composure no longer seamless, and I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because the moment that had been building since the night before had finally arrived, and everything they thought they were claiming had never been theirs to begin with. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because there was nothing left that could immediately reshape what had just been said. The word me still hanging in the air, quiet but immovable. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on Margaret, but the certainty that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by something slower, heavier, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once but settles piece by piece. That is not possible, he said finally, but the statement lacked force. It sounded more like something he needed to hear than something he believed. Margaret did not react to the contradiction. She simply held his gaze, steady and composed. "It is already done," she replied, her tone unchanged, and the simplicity of that response removed any space for negotiation. Sophia let out a small breath, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal the strain she had been holding back. "There must have been a mistake in the paperwork," she said, her voice measured but tighter now, reaching for something procedural, something that could be corrected, because that was the only path left that still suggested control. Margaret tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement of the attempt. "There was no mistake," she said. "The documents were reviewed, signed, and filed with full clarity." And the precision of her words left no room for reinterpretation. Daniel's grip on his glass shifted, his fingers tightening, then loosening again as if he had suddenly remembered where he was, who was watching. He glanced around the room for a brief second, as if searching for something familiar, something stable. But all he found were faces that were no longer neutral, no longer casually observing. They were watching now, fully, attentively, because the story they thought they were witnessing had changed, and they could feel it. Sophia stepped closer to him, her voice lower now, directed more toward Margaret than the room. "Even if that were true," she said, "it does not change the fact that we are family, and families support each other." The argument returned to its original form, but now it sounded different. Less like a shared value, and more like a claim, something being asserted rather than assumed. Margaret's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a clarity that sharpened the moment further. "Support is never built on expectation," she said, "and it is never announced before it is given." The words landed cleanly, without emphasis, but they carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, more focused. Daniel inhaled slowly, a measured breath, as if he was trying to regain his footing. "So that is it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but still carrying a trace of disbelief. "You are saying that we have no place there, no future in that space?" Margaret did not hesitate. "I am saying that your future is not dependent on something that was never yours," she replied. And this time, the statement did not just correct him, it redirected him entirely. Sophia's composure shifted again, more visibly now, the smooth edges of her control beginning to give way to something more immediate. "We have invested time, planning, expectations," she said, and the words came faster now, less measured. "We have made decisions based on what we believed was going to happen." Margaret listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, and when Sophia finished, she responded just as calmly as before. "Then those decisions were made without the necessary understanding," she said, and the quiet finality of that sentence left no room for argument. "I watched them both, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a kind of distant clarity, because I recognized the moment for what it was, not a conflict, not even a confrontation, but a correction, something that had been set in motion long before tonight. Something that had simply chosen this moment to reveal itself." Daniel lowered his glass slightly, his arm no longer raised, no longer part of any gesture or presentation. "You could have told us," he said, and this time, there was something different in his voice, not anger, not even accusation, but something closer to frustration mixed with realization. Margaret's gaze softened just a fraction, not in sympathy, but in understanding of the statement itself. "You could have asked," she replied. And the distinction was quiet but unmistakable. Sophia exhaled slowly, her shoulders shifting as if the tension she had been holding could no longer be maintained in the same way. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the kind of silence that waits. It was the kind that absorbs, that processes, that understands something has already been decided. I felt the weight of the moment settle fully now, not as something overwhelming, but as something complete. The uncertainty that had lingered before was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt steady, grounded. Margaret adjusted her hands slightly, the movement small, deliberate, and then she spoke again, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. The purpose of the trust was not to exclude, she said. It was to preserve. She paused, not for effect, but because the words themselves required space, and preservation requires clarity. Daniel's eyes lowered for a brief second, not in defeat, but in thought. The kind that comes when something has finally been understood, even if it is not accepted. Sophia remained still, her expression no longer controlled in the same way, the polished surface replaced by something more real, more exposed. And I sat where I had been from the beginning, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because the moment had passed the point of reaction. It had moved into something else entirely, something quieter, something more final. And in that quiet, it became clear to everyone in that room that what had been taken for granted had never been available to take. The room did not return to normal after Margaret finished speaking. It remained suspended in that quiet, attentive stillness where every movement carried meaning, where even the smallest shift in posture seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel stood there with his glass lowered now, no longer part of a gesture, no longer a symbol of celebration, just something he had not yet decided what to do with. And for the first time since he had raised it, he looked uncertain about where to place it. Sophia did not reach for him this time. She remained where she was, her composure no longer effortless, her expression no longer something she could fully control. And I watched them both without moving, without speaking, because there was nothing left that required my voice. The truth had already been placed in the room, and it was not something that could be undone by explanation. Daniel finally exhaled, a longer breath this time, one that seemed to release something he had been holding on to. So that is it, he said quietly, not to challenge, not even to argue, but to confirm, as if saying it aloud might help him understand it fully. Margaret gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emphasized, just enough to acknowledge the statement. That is it, she replied, and the simplicity of the exchange made it feel more final than any extended argument could have. There was a pause then, longer than before, not uncomfortable, not awkward, but heavy, as if everyone present was adjusting to a new understanding of what they had just witnessed. Sophia shifted her weight slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate. I think, she said, her voice quieter now, more measured, that this conversation may not be appropriate for this setting. It was an attempt, not to deny what had happened, but to contain it, to move it somewhere less visible, less exposed. Margaret did not respond immediately. She let the words sit, and then she inclined her head slightly. It was made appropriate the moment it was announced, she said, and there was no sharpness in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of cause and effect. Daniel's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the faces of the guests, the subtle expressions of curiosity, surprise, and something else, something closer to understanding. And for a moment, I could see the shift in him again, not just uncertainty now, but awareness, the realization that this was no longer a private matter, no longer something that could be reshaped behind closed doors. He set his glass down carefully on the nearest table, the sound soft but clear in the quiet. I did not realize, he said slowly, choosing each word with more care than before, that the situation was different than I believed. It was not an apology, not quite, but it was the closest he had come to acknowledging the gap between assumption and reality. Margaret watched him steadily, her expression unchanged. Belief is not the same as understanding, she said, and the distinction settled between them, clear and unyielding. Sophia's eyes moved toward me again, but this time there was no expectation in them, no assumption that I would step in, only a brief, searching look that seemed to recognize something had shifted permanently. I met her gaze for a moment, then let it pass. Because there was nothing left to bridge, no role left for me to play in the version of events they had imagined. The music in the background continued, soft and distant, as if it belonged to a different room, a different moment, and the contrast between that gentle melody and the stillness around us made the scene feel even more defined, more precise. Margaret adjusted her posture slightly, a small, composed movement that signaled the conversation had reached its natural end. This is a celebration, she said, her voice calm, steady, and it should remain one. The words were not a dismissal, not a command, but a redirection, a reminder of what the evening had been meant to be before it was reshaped. Daniel nodded once, a small, controlled motion, as if accepting something he had not expected to accept. Sophia did not speak, but her shoulders lowered slightly, the tension shifting, not gone, but no longer held in the same way. I remained seated for another moment, letting the stillness settle fully, letting the finality of the exchange become part of the room, and then I rose slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate movement that drew quiet attention without asking for it, the fabric of my dress falling into place as I stood, my hands relaxed at my sides. I did not look at Daniel. I did not look at Sophia. I looked ahead, toward the open space of the room, toward the part of the evening that still existed beyond what had just happened, and I took a step forward, the sound of my heel against the floor soft but clear, and in that moment, it was not the words that defined what had happened, not the explanations or the corrections, it was the shift, the quiet, undeniable shift in understanding, the recognition that what had been assumed was no longer available to assume, that what had been presented as certain was never certain at all. And as I moved past them, past the place where the conversation had unfolded, I could feel the weight of their attention, not heavy, not pressing, but present, because they understood now, not just what had been said, but what it meant. And in that understanding, there was no need for anything further, no need for argument, no need for resolution, only the quiet acceptance that something had been revealed, and it could not be unseen. The music did not stop, but it no longer filled the room the way it had before. It drifted instead, softer, as if it had stepped back to make space for what had just happened. I walked slowly across the floor, not toward anything in particular, just away from the center, away from the place where expectations had been spoken out loud and quietly undone, and with each step, I felt something settle deeper inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when something you have suspected for a long time finally reveals itself without disguise. I reached the edge of the room where the large windows stretched from floor to ceiling, the city lights beyond them steady and distant, unchanged by anything that had just unfolded, and I paused there for a moment, not turning back, not checking who was watching, because I already knew they were, not in the same way as before, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. I placed my hand lightly against the cool surface of the glass, feeling the faint contrast between the warmth of the room and the stillness outside, and I allowed myself a single breath, slow and even, because the moment had passed the point of reaction. It had become something else entirely, something that no longer required my attention to maintain. Behind me, I could hear the subtle return of movement, the soft shift of chairs, the low murmur of voices beginning again, hesitant at first, as if people were testing whether it was appropriate to resume the evening, and then gradually, more naturally, the rhythm of the celebration trying to find its place again. I did not turn immediately. I let the sound exist without responding to it, because I understood now that what had changed was not the room, not the event, but the way it would be remembered, the way it would be understood long after the music ended and the lights dimmed. A few steps away, I sensed movement before I saw it, and when I finally turned slightly, I saw Lily approaching, her expression softer than before, no longer strained, no longer caught between two versions of the same moment. She stopped a few feet from me, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. "Grandma," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that felt genuine, unfiltered. "I did not know," she added, and I believed her, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she held them, without defense, without expectation, just an acknowledgement. I gave a small nod, not as a response, but as a recognition of the moment. "You were not supposed to," I said, my voice calm, steady, and she exhaled slightly, as if that answer had released something she had been holding. "I just wanted today to be simple," she said, her gaze drifting briefly toward the center of the room before returning to me. "I thought it would be." There was no complaint in her tone, no accusation, just a quiet statement of what she had hoped for. I let her words settle for a moment before responding. "Sometimes clarity does not wait for the right day," I said, and she considered that, her expression thoughtful, not fully at ease, but no longer uncertain in the same way. Behind her, I could see Daniel standing near one of the tables. His posture more contained now, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if he was navigating a space that no longer felt as familiar. Sophia stood beside him, her expression composed again, but not in the same way as before. There was something more measured in it now, something that suggested she was no longer shaping the moment, but adjusting to it. They did not approach, they did not call out, and I did not expect them to, because there are moments when distance is not created by space, but by understanding, and that kind of distance does not close quickly. Lily followed my gaze for a brief second, then looked back at me. "Are you going to leave?" she asked, and there was a hint of something else in her voice now, something closer to concern. I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "This is still your day." And the simplicity of that answer seemed to settle something in her. She nodded once, a small, quiet motion, and then after a brief pause, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, the gesture natural, unforced, and I returned it just as simply, not tightly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the connection that still remained. When she stepped back, her expression had softened further, not entirely free of what had happened, but no longer defined by it. She gave me a small smile, and then she turned, moving back toward the center of the room, toward the part of the evening that still belonged to her. I watched her go for a moment, then let my gaze shift once more to the city beyond the glass, the lights steady, unchanged, and in that stillness, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost quiet in its certainty. The moment that had unfolded tonight was never really about the penthouse. It was about assumption, about expectation, about the quiet ways people begin to believe that what has not been given is already theirs. And as the music gradually found its place again, as the voices in the room regained their rhythm, I remained where I was, not removed, not distant, but grounded, because the truth had already done what it needed to do, and everything that followed would move around it, not through it, and that was enough. The music found its rhythm again, not as strong as before, but steady enough to carry the evening forward. Conversations resumed in soft layers, cautious at first, then gradually more natural, as if the room itself had decided that what had happened would not define everything that followed. And yet, beneath that surface, something had shifted permanently, something that could not be undone simply by returning to polite laughter and raised glasses. I remained near the window for a moment longer, watching the reflection of the room in the glass rather than the city beyond it, because reflections reveal things that direct observation often hides. And in that reflection, I could see Daniel moving again, slower now, more deliberate, speaking quietly to a guest who nodded with careful attention. Not the easy agreement from earlier, but something more measured, more aware. Sophia stood beside him, her posture composed. But there was a difference in the way she held herself, the precision. Still there, but softened at the edges, as if she had adjusted her expectations without fully letting go of them. I turned away from the glass then, not because I needed distance, but because I understood that the moment of observation had served its purpose, and as I stepped back into the flow of the room, I became aware of how differently it felt, the same people, the same setting, but the unspoken understanding now woven through every interaction. I moved toward one of the smaller tables, where a few guests had gathered, their conversation pausing briefly as I approached, not out of discomfort, but out of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that I was no longer simply part of the background. "Of the evening, Mrs. Carter," one of them said, offering a polite smile, and I returned it with the same calm expression I had held throughout the night, because there was no need to change it now, not when the truth had already been established. I listened for a moment as they spoke, their words light, carefully chosen, not avoiding what had happened, but not addressing it directly either, and I understood that balance, the instinct to move forward without reopening something that had already found its conclusion. After a short exchange, I excused myself gently, not withdrawing, but simply moving, because I had no need to remain in any one place. The evening no longer required me to anchor it. As I walked across the room, I felt a quiet steadiness within me, not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from clarity, the understanding that what had been assumed no longer held any weight, and that realization did not need to be reinforced. It simply existed, near the far side of the room. I noticed Margaret seated once more, her posture unchanged, her presence just as composed as it had been when she stood. She did not look at me immediately, but I knew she was aware of my approach, because she always was. I took the seat beside her without speaking, allowing the silence to exist naturally between us. And after a moment, she turned her head slightly, her expression calm. It was handled, she said, not as a question, not even as a statement that required confirmation, but as a simple acknowledgement of what had already taken place. I nodded once, just as simply, because there was nothing more to add to it. They assumed, I said after a brief pause, my voice quiet but steady, and she inclined her head slightly. They did, she replied, her tone carrying no judgment, only observation. We sat there for a moment, not speaking, not needing to, because the conversation had already reached its natural conclusion. And in that quiet, I found myself thinking back, not to the moment that had just passed, but to the pattern that had led to it, the small conversations, the subtle shifts, the way certain expectations had been introduced gradually, never stated outright, but always present, always building towards something that had never actually been agreed upon. And I realized then that this moment had not appeared suddenly. It had been forming for a long time, shaped by assumptions that had never been challenged until now. Margaret adjusted her hands slightly in her lap, a small, composed movement. Clarity is rarely welcomed when it interrupts expectation, she said, and I let the words settle, because they carried a truth that extended far beyond this evening. But it is necessary, she added, and I nodded again, not in agreement, but in recognition. Across the room, I could see Daniel again, now speaking with Lily, his posture more contained, his movements more careful, and there was something in the way he leaned slightly toward her, something quieter, more present, as if the earlier confidence had given way to something more reflective. Sophia stood nearby, not interrupting, not directing, simply observing, her expression thoughtful, measured, as if she was recalibrating the framework she had been working within. I watched them for a moment, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a kind of detached understanding, because whatever adjustments they made now would come from a different place, a place shaped by what had been revealed, and that difference would define everything that followed. Margaret's gaze followed mine briefly, then returned forward. They will adapt, she said, her voice calm, certain. And I considered that, not as a prediction, but as a possibility, because people do adapt, not always immediately, not always willingly, but eventually, when the structure they relied on changes, they find a new way to stand within it. The music grew slightly louder again, the rhythm more confident, and a few guests began to move toward the dance floor, the evening continuing in its intended direction, not unchanged, but not undone either. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself to settle fully into the moment as it now existed, not the one that had been imagined, not the one that had been disrupted, but the one that remained, steady, clear, and in that clarity, I understood something that had not been fully visible before. The value of what had been preserved was not just the space itself, not the penthouse or the view or the structure. It was the boundary, the quiet, firm line between what is offered and what is assumed. And as the evening moved forward, as voices blended and music carried through the room, I remained exactly where I was, not withdrawn, not distant, but grounded in that understanding, because it no longer needed to be defended, it simply needed to exist. And that was enough. The evening did not rush to erase what had happened. It absorbed it, slowly, almost deliberately, as if the room itself understood that some moments are not meant to disappear, but to settle quietly into everything that follows. The music grew steadier now, no longer hesitant, and a few couples had begun to move across the dance floor, their steps careful at first, then more natural, guided by rhythm rather than thought. I remained seated beside Margaret, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly together, not withdrawn from the evening, but no longer anchored to any expectation within it. Across the room, Daniel's conversation with Lily had ended, and now he stood alone for a moment, his gaze unfocused, not scanning the room, not searching for attention, but simply still, as if he was allowing the silence within himself to catch up with everything that had just unfolded. Sophia approached him again, her movements composed, measured, and she spoke quietly, too softly for the words to reach me. but I could see the shift in his posture as he listened, not resistant, not dismissive, but attentive in a way that felt different from before, more grounded, more aware, and I realized then that what had changed was not just the outcome of a single moment, but the way they would now interpret everything that came after it. Margaret adjusted slightly in her chair, the movement small but deliberate. "There is a difference," she said calmly, her gaze directed forward, not at me, not at anyone in particular, between losing something and realizing it was never yours. I let the words settle because they carried a quiet weight that did not need to be expanded upon. "They will understand that in time," she added, and I nodded once, not because I expected it to happen quickly, but because I recognized the truth in it. Understanding does not arrive on demand. It forms slowly, shaped by reflection rather than reaction. A server passed by with a tray of champagne glasses, the soft clink of glass against glass returning to the rhythm of the evening. I reached for one without thinking, not to drink, but to hold, the cool surface steady in my hand. A small, grounding detail in a moment that no longer felt uncertain. I glanced again toward Daniel and Sophia, and this time, I saw something I had not seen earlier. Not tension, not calculation, but adjustment. The kind that comes when the framework you relied on has shifted and you are beginning to build a new one. It was subtle, not yet complete, but present, and that was enough to change the way I viewed them in that moment. Not as opponents, not even as participants in a conflict, but as individuals recalibrating their understanding of something they had misread. The dance floor filled slowly, laughter returning in softer waves, not forced, not overly bright, but genuine enough to carry the evening forward. I rose from my seat again, not because I needed to move, but because the moment allowed it. Margaret did not look at me this time. She did not need to. The quiet exchange between us had already been completed, and I stepped away, moving through the room with a calm that felt natural, unforced. A few guests nodded as I passed, their expressions respectful, not overly curious, not intrusive, just aware, and I returned each acknowledgement with the same steady composure. Because there was nothing left to explain, near the edge of the dance floor, Lily caught my eye again, her expression lighter now, more at ease, and she gave me a small, grateful smile before turning back to her husband, their hands finding each other naturally as they moved together, and in that simple gesture, I could see the part of the evening that had remained untouched, the part that still belonged entirely to her, and that mattered, more than anything else that had been revealed. I moved toward one of the quieter corners of the room, where the lights softened and the sound of the music felt more distant, and I allowed myself a moment to stand there, not apart from the celebration, but slightly removed from its center, and in that space, I understood something more clearly than I had before. The purpose of what had been done was not to create distance, not to isolate or exclude, but to define, to draw a line that had always existed but had never been acknowledged, and now that it had been made visible, everything else could adjust around it. Daniel approached then, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a measured pace that suggested he had taken time to consider his steps. He stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too distant. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter than it had been earlier, not weakened, but more deliberate, and I turned to face him fully, my expression unchanged, my posture steady. "I should have asked," he added after a brief pause, and the statement hung there, simple, unembellished, without justification or explanation, and I let it remain that way for a moment before responding. "Yes," I said, just as simply, not as a correction, not as a reprimand, but as an acknowledgement of what he had already understood. He nodded once, the motion small but genuine, and for a brief second, there was something else in his expression, something closer to reflection than resistance. "I did not realize how much I was assuming," he continued, and I could hear the shift in his voice, the difference between speaking to be heard and speaking to understand. "Assumption is quiet," I said, "until it is not." And he let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but something lighter than before, as if the weight of the moment had shifted just enough to allow space for it. Sophia did not join him. She remained where she was, watching, not intruding, and that distance felt intentional, appropriate. I did not ask questions. I did not revisit what had already been resolved, because there was no need to reopen something that had reached its conclusion. Daniel gave a small nod again, then stepped back, not abruptly, not awkwardly, just enough to signal that the exchange had ended naturally. And as he moved away, returning to the flow of the evening, I remained where I was for a moment longer, the music steady, the room alive again, and I understood that while the moment itself had passed, its meaning would remain, not as something disruptive, but as something foundational, something that would quietly shape every decision, every expectation that followed. And in that understanding, I felt no need to add anything further, because what had been revealed was already enough. The music carried the evening forward with a steadiness that no longer felt forced. Conversations flowed more naturally now, laughter returning in quieter, more grounded tones, and yet beneath it all, there was a new awareness woven into every interaction, something subtle but undeniable. I remained near the edge of the room for a moment longer after Daniel stepped away, allowing the space around me to settle into its new rhythm. And as I did, I realized that what had shifted was not just their understanding, but mine as well, not in reaction, not in response, but in recognition. The recognition that clarity, once revealed, does not need to be reinforced. It simply exists, and everything else adjusts around it. I took a slow step forward, moving back into the center of the room, not to reclaim anything, not to reassert presence, but simply because there was no longer any reason to remain apart from it. The celebration had resumed, not as it had been before, but as something quieter, more deliberate. And in that difference, there was a kind of balance. Lily moved across the dance floor with an ease that had returned gradually, her laughter now more natural, less restrained, and I watched her for a moment, understanding that whatever had unfolded earlier had not taken this from her. It had only clarified something that had been separate from it all along, and that distinction mattered. Margaret remained seated where I had left her, her posture unchanged, her presence just as composed, and I knew without looking that she was aware of everything still, not observing in the way others did, but simply knowing, as she always had. I moved past her without stopping this time, not out of distance, but because there was nothing left that needed to be said between us. The understanding had already been shared, and I found myself near the long table where the evening's details had been carefully arranged, the soft glow of candles, the precise placement of glassware, the quiet elegance of something designed to feel effortless. And I noticed then how much of the evening had been built on intention, on planning, on the careful shaping of an experience that would be remembered in a certain way. And I realized that what had happened earlier had not undone that intention. It had simply revealed something that had been overlooked within it, something that now existed alongside it, not in opposition, but in contrast. Daniel approached again, not alone this time, Sophia at his side, her posture composed, her expression measured but no longer distant. They stopped a few steps away, not intruding, not hesitant, simply present. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice steady, not searching for permission, not performing, just speaking, and I turned toward them fully, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed. "We should have been clearer," Sophia added, her tone controlled, but there was something more genuine in it now, something less constructed, less deliberate, and I considered her words for a moment, not evaluating them, not weighing them, just allowing them to exist. "Clarity does not begin with statements," I said calmly. "It begins with understanding." And there was no sharpness in my voice, no correction, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had already been revealed. Daniel nodded once, his gaze steady now, no longer uncertain in the same way, but not fully resolved either. "We are going to figure things out," he said, and I recognized the difference in that statement. Not a claim, not an expectation, but a process, something that would take time. And I inclined my head slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because that was the only response it required. Sophia glanced briefly toward the center of the room, then back at me. "We did not mean for this to happen like that," she said, and there was a pause after her words, as if she understood that intention and outcome are rarely the same. I held her gaze for a moment, then let it pass. "It happened as it needed to," I replied, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to settle something between us, not resolve it, not erase it, but place it in a context where it no longer needed to be argued. They did not stay longer. They did not press further. and that in itself was a shift. A quiet recognition that some moments do not require continuation, only acknowledgement. As they stepped back into the flow of the evening, I remained where I was for a moment. The soft light of the candles reflecting in the glassware, the subtle movement of guests passing by, the steady rhythm of music continuing without interruption, and I understood then that what had been established earlier was not a barrier, not a division, but a boundary, something that defines without isolating, something that clarifies without needing to be defended. Margaret's voice reached me again, not from across the room, but from just behind me, calm, steady. "They have begun to see," she said, and I turned slightly, meeting her gaze, and for the first time that evening, there was the faintest hint of something softer in her expression, not approval, not satisfaction, but recognition. "Seeing is the first step," I replied, and she inclined her head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement. "And understanding follows," she said, and we stood there for a moment, not speaking further, because the exchange had already reached its conclusion. The room moved around us, the evening continuing, not unchanged, but not undone either. And in that continuation, there was something steady, something clear, something that did not need to be revisited or redefined, because it had already taken its place. And as I looked across the room once more, at Daniel, at Sophia, at Lily, at the quiet flow of the celebration that had found its rhythm again, I understood that what had happened would not be remembered as a disruption, but as a moment of definition, a point where assumption met clarity, where expectation met reality, and where everything that followed would carry that understanding forward, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet ways that matter most. The night did not end with a dramatic moment. It softened, gradually, like a room settling after a long conversation that no one expected but everyone needed. The music carried on with quiet confidence, the dance floor filled with gentle movement, and laughter returned in a way that felt more grounded, less performative, as if something beneath it had been cleared. I remained where I was for a while, watching the rhythm of the evening continue without me needing to shape it, without anyone expecting me to respond or explain, and in that stillness, I realized that what had changed was not just the outcome of a single conversation, but the way every silence would now be understood, every assumption reconsidered, every expectation held a little more carefully. Daniel and Sophia moved through the room differently now, not withdrawn, not isolated, but aware, their presence no longer built on certainty, but on something quieter, something more deliberate. I saw Daniel pause at one point near the edge of the dance floor, watching Lily and her husband as they laughed, their movements light, unburdened, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not regret, not even reflection exactly, but recognition, the kind that does not demand attention but changes behavior. Sophia stood beside him again, not guiding, not directing, simply present, and the space between them felt different, less aligned in purpose, more open, more uncertain, but not fractured, just recalibrated. And I understood then that what had been revealed tonight would not divide them. It would reshape them, slowly, in ways they would come to understand on their own terms. Margaret remained composed as always, her presence steady, not seeking acknowledgement, not needing it. And when our eyes met once more across the room, there was no need for words, only a shared understanding that the moment had reached its natural conclusion, that nothing more needed to be said. The evening continued to unfold in quiet layers. Speeches resumed, softer now, more sincere, less polished, as if the surface had been stripped away just enough to reveal something real beneath it. I listened as Lily spoke briefly, her voice steady, her gratitude clear, not referencing what had happened, but carrying a depth that had not been there before. And I recognized that clarity does not just define boundaries. It deepens meaning. It changes how moments are experienced, not just how they are remembered. As the night moved toward its close, guests began to gather their things, conversations winding down into quieter exchanges, and the room gradually shifted from celebration to conclusion, not abruptly, not dramatically, but naturally, like something reaching its end exactly when it should. I stepped toward the exit slowly, not out of urgency, not to escape, but because the evening had given what it needed to give, and I felt no need to extend it beyond that. Daniel approached one last time, not to reopen anything, not to revisit what had already been understood, but simply to stand beside me for a moment. "Thank you for staying," he said, and his voice was steady, not seeking approval, not asking for reassurance, just acknowledging something simple, and I nodded once. It was important, I replied, and he seemed to accept that without needing further explanation. Sophia offered a small, composed smile, not forced, not strategic, just present, and I returned it in the same way. Because whatever had shifted did not need to be defined in that moment. It only needed to exist. Margaret joined me near the doorway, her presence as steady as ever, and together we stepped into the quieter space beyond the room, where the music softened into distance and the air felt cooler, clearer, and as the door closed behind us, I did not look back immediately, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left unresolved that required it. When I finally turned slightly, I saw the room through the glass, the soft lights, the remaining guests, the continuation of something that no longer depended on me, and I understood that the significance of the night was not in what had been taken away, but in what had been clarified, the quiet line between what is offered and what is assumed, the difference between presence and entitlement, the space where understanding replaces expectation. And as I stepped forward into the night, the city lights stretching out ahead, steady and unchanged, I felt no sense of loss, no lingering weight, only a calm, steady clarity that settled into place without resistance, because what had been revealed had not diminished anything, it had defined it, and in that definition, there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove, only the quiet certainty that some things are not meant to be given, not because they lack value, but because their value is precisely in the fact that they are understood, respected, and preserved, and that understanding, once seen clearly, does not need to be spoken again.